So if you ask a kid to draw a picture of a house, they don't usually start by having to invent the paper or the crayons, right?
Right, no, they just use what's there.
Yeah, they take what's already sitting right in front of them, the blank page, the waxy colors, and they just start drawing lines. They create boundaries. They're basically making order out of a blank space.
Exactly, they're organizers, not conjurers.
Right. But when we talk about like the ultimate house of the universe itself, we have this deeply ingrained assumption that the ultimate creator did something completely different. We assume they acted more like a magician, pulling the rabbit of existence out of this absolute empty hat of nothingness.
Yeah, and that right there is the fundamental difference. It's the difference between an architect who, organizes existing materials and a wizard conjuring matter out of a pure void.
Pure void, yeah.
And for centuries, we've been told that this conjuring act, this creation from absolute zero, is the definitive dividing line. Like, it's what separates early so-called primitive beliefs from advanced religion.
Which honestly brings us to the core of what we were pulling apart today. Welcome to today's deep dive, by the way. We are looking at a stack of sources that completely upends that entire narrative for you.
It really does. It flips the whole script.
It totally does. We have critical analyses of ancient Mesopotamian and Greek myths, direct excerpts from the Torah, the Bible, and the Quran. And we're also looking really closely at Safa Kaçmaz' 25-year thesis on Sociogony.
Which is fascinating.
Oh, it's incredible. And it takes direct aim at the prevailing academic frameworks taught by scholars like Kürşat Demirci.
Right. Because the central question these sources force us to ask is whether creation from nothing, or ex nihilo in Latin, as it's called, whether that is an actual historical truth found in these sacred texts, or, and this is the big one, if it is a massive centuries-old illusion layered over the original words.
A theological illusion. Okay, so to understand the claim that ex nihilo is a later invention, we have to look at humanity's oldest recorded creation stories.
We have to go back to the beginning, literally.
Right, literally. So usually we hear about the primordial chaos, and in modern English, chaos sounds like pure madness, or maybe like a dark, empty vacuum in deep space.
Sure, like an explosion at a paint factory.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But when we look at Hesiod's Theogonia from ancient Greece, the text famously begins with, quote, "First there was chaos."
Yeah, but our sources clarify that the original Greek concept of chaos doesn't actually mean a literal vacuum of non-existence.
It doesn't.
No. It refers to a chasm, a gap, or an undefined, irregular state of existence.
Okay.
So it is a state of being. It's just simply without boundaries or form. And we see a really similar parallel concept when we look at the ancient Babylonian epic, the Enuma Elish.
Right, the Mesopotamian story.
Exactly. The text describes a time before the heavens and earth were even named, but it explicitly states that the water deities Apsu and Tiamat already existed.
Oh, wow. So sweet water and bitter water mingling together.
Yes. Matter was already present.
Okay, let's unpack this a little bit. So the ancient view of creation is less like a magician making a universe appear out of thin air, and more like, well, walking into an incredibly messy, cluttered room and finally organizing it into a livable space.
That's a really good way to visualize it.
Or, actually, maybe a better way to look at it is like writing computer code. Like a massive block of text might technically exist on a screen, but it's completely useless, chaotic data until you compile it, assign variables, and give it a function.
Right. You're turning unformatted raw data into a working operating system.
Exactly.
An assigning function is the absolute key mechanism here, because in the ancient mind, to name something is to give it a function in the world, and giving it a function is the act of creation.
So naming is creating.
Yes. The sources really emphasize that across these ancient narratives, there is always a pre-existing state. Creation is exclusively the act of separating, ordering, and naming what is already sitting right there.
Okay, I think most people who have taken a college mythology class wouldn't be too shocked by that. The Babylonians and the Greeks were organizing the messy room.
Right.
But the natural assumption, and what we're almost always taught, is that it was the monotheistic texts that finally brought in the idea of ex nihilo.
That's the standard narrative, yeah.
We assume the Torah, the Bible, and the Quran brought the concept of creation from absolute nothingness into the world.
Well, our sources argue that this assumption is actually the single biggest misconception in theological history.
Wait, really? The biggest?
By far. When we bypass the centuries of commentary and read the actual words written in these three major sacred texts, a completely different picture emerges. Let's start with the Torah, specifically Genesis 1.1-2.
Okay, I actually have the direct translation right here. Let me read it.
Okay.
It says, "Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters."
Notice anything missing.
Yeah, it doesn't actually say God created the waters in that specific moment. The deep and the waters are they're already there.
Exactly. The Hebrew phrase used to describe the earth in that passage is tohu wabuhu. Right. Which translates to formless and empty, or a chaotic wasteland. So the earth existed. It was an unorganized, chaotic state of matter, but it was matter nonetheless.
Okay, well.
God's first action isn't conjuring the water, it's calling forth light and separating it from the darkness. It is an act of division and organization.
Just like the messy room. Okay, well, let's look at the New Testament of the Bible then. In John 1.3, it says, "All things were made through him." And Hebrews 11.3, it states that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible.
Right.
But again, my Bruin translates that as a transformation of states. Like going from invisible to visible isn't the same as going from absolute non-existence to existence.
You're hitting the nail on the head. It establishes that the structuring of the universe belongs to God, sure, but it fundamentally lacks that ontological leap from absolute zero to something.
It's describing a transformation.
Yes. And the Quran follows this exact same continuous pattern. Surah Al-Anbiya, verse 30, explicitly mentions that the heavens and the earth were joined together as one entity before they were separated.
Joined and then separated.
And Surah Fussilat, verse 11, talks about God turning to the sky when it was smoke and commanding it to come together.
Okay, joined together and separated. Smoke being gathered. That is undeniably a pre-existing structure being divided and shaped.
Exactly.
But wait, hold on. My brain is snagging on something here. I grew up hearing, and I think a lot of people are familiar with this, the famous Islamic phrase, be, and it is, kun fayakun.
Ah, yes, kun fayakun.
Yeah. How does that fit into this messy room concept? It doesn't be, and it is strongly applied, like snapping your fingers and creating matter from a pure void.
It sounds like it, doesn't it? But that phrase is the perfect example of where historical text and later theology collide. The sources specifically analyze B, and it is from Quran 2.117. Reading that phrase as a spontaneous creation from absolute zero is actually a retrospective interpretation.
Meaning what, exactly?
It comes from the later classical Kalam period, which is the era of medieval Islamic scholastic theology. It is a philosophical lens that was applied to the text long, long after it was originally written.
Oh, I see. So the medieval theologians read their own philosophical debates backward into the text.
Precisely. They intervened in the text's original meaning. Across the Torah, the Bible, and the Quran, when we analyze the raw textual data, creation is consistently presented as an act of separating, arranging, formatting, and naming.
Formatting data.
Right. The explicit statement, God created the universe from absolute nothingness, is simply not in there.
Which leaves us with an enormous historical mystery. I mean, if creation from nothing isn't actually written in the foundational texts of Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, where on earth did it come from?
Right.
And why did it become the absolute unquestionable standard for how we view God today?
Well, to answer that, we have to turn to the work of Safa Kaçmaz and his 25-year research project on what he calls Sociogony.
Sociogony.
Yeah. Kaçmaz looked at texts starting from early Mesopotamia and traced the concept of creation forward. And his thesis argues that in all these ancient and sacred texts, true creation is entirely about building social order.
Wait, social order? How does separating water from land, or naming the sun and the moon, translate into social order? That sounds like nature, not society.
To us, maybe. But in the ancient worldview, the two are completely intertwined. Establishing boundaries in the cosmos reflects and justifies the boundaries in human society.
Oh, I see.
Think about it. When a deity names the sun and the moon, they are establishing the cycles of time. And time dictates the agricultural calendar.
Which dictates the religious festival.
Exactly, which then dictates the hierarchy of the priests and the rulers. By ordering the physical universe, the creator is establishing the blueprint for the human social hierarchy. That is sociogony, the birth of society through the myth of cosmic ordering.
Okay, I follow that. That makes sense. The texts are fundamentally about establishing a structured, functioning reality out of chaos.
Right.
But that still leaves the giant elephant in the room. Why did ex nihilo take over? If the sacred texts are all about organizing, why did later theologians invent the idea of creation from absolute zero?
Because the invention of ex nihilo was essentially a massive theological defense mechanism.
A defense mechanism. Against what?
Well, the doctrine was formalized heavily during the patristic period of Christianity. That's the era of the early church fathers in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And it later permeated Jewish and Islamic thought. We have to look at the intellectual climate they were surviving in at the time.
Okay, set the scene.
They were completely surrounded by Hellenistic philosophies, particularly Platonism and Gnosticism.
If I remember my philosophy classes, in a lot of those Greek schools, matter itself was viewed as inherently flawed or corrupt or even outright evil.
Yes, and that was exactly the problem they faced. If you concede that God worked with pre-existing eternal matter, the messy room, you create a massive theological vulnerability for yourself.
How so?
First, it implies that matter is co-eternal with God, which threatens God's absolute supremacy. If matter has always been there alongside him, he isn't the sole absolute reality, right?
Right.
Second, it makes God look like a demiurge, a cosmic craftsman who is limited by the quality of the materials he has on hand.
I see the trap. So if the world is full of suffering and flaws, and God just organized pre-existing matter, the critics could say, well, God did his best, but the raw materials were garbage.
Exactly. To counter that, to make God's power completely limitless and infinite, theologians had to sever God from matter entirely. They constructed the doctrine of ex nihilo to prove that God is the author of absolutely everything, including the very concept of matter itself. The sources highlight this as a product of belief production.
Belief production.
Yes. It was a necessary doctrine to win the philosophical debates of late antiquity, and it was defended fiercely, even though it meant overlaying a completely new idea onto the original text.
It's just astonishing to think about. I mean, for centuries, billions of people have read these sacred texts through a pair of philosophical glasses that were manufactured hundreds of years after the texts were written.
Yes.
We see ex nihilo because the early church fathers and medieval scholars told us we had to see it to protect the majesty of God, not because it's the actual vocabulary used in Genesis or the Quran.
It really demonstrates the sheer power of retrospective interpretation. And honestly, this exposes a significant flaw in how modern academia still approaches the history of religion today.
Right, because our sources deliver a highly critical analysis of prevailing academic frameworks, specifically targeting the model popularized by scholars like Kürşad Demirci.
Yes. You would assume that modern scholars with access to all this linguistic and historical data would be pointing out the difference between the text and the theology.
Yeah, you'd think they'd separate the two.
But instead, the standard academic curriculum still teaches this rigid binary. Primitive religions, organized chaos, and advanced monotheism achieved the intellectual leap of ex nihilo.
Why? If the texts don't say it, why is it still taught that way?
Well, the sources reveal that this framework isn't a modern, rigorous scientific discovery at all. It is largely a recycled, oversimplified version of 19th century evolutionary religion theories.
Oh, wow.
We're talking about the anthropological models developed by figures like Edward Burnett Tyler and James George Frazer.
Right, the classic Victorian anthropologists, the ones who argued for this really neat linear evolution of human cognition.
Exactly.
Like the idea that humanity started at animism, slowly leveled up to polytheism, and finally reached the ultimate enlightened boss level of monotheism.
That's exactly it. They operated on a highly biased assumption of progress. They believed that early, quote-unquote, primitive humans were cognitively incapable of grasping abstract metaphysical concepts like absolute creation. Therefore, they argued that monotheism represented a sudden, miraculous rupture in human history, a massive evolutionary leap forward that brought ex nihilo into existence.
So passing this evolutionary model off as a fresh academic insight is a bit like, well, it's like holding up a rotary phone, pointing out that it evolved from the telegraph and claiming you just invented the concept of technological progress.
That's a great way to put it.
It completely ignores the actual mechanics of how the technology, or in this case, the theology, actually works and connects.
The rotary phone analogy highlights the exact methodological flaw here. Presenting monotheism as a sudden rupture that spontaneously generated the idea of creation from nothing, it directly violates the textual evidence we just examined.
Right.
The linguistic data simply does not support a rupture.
Because there is a clear, undeniable continuity. The texts themselves show an unbroken thread. I mean, the ancient Babylonians had Apsu and Tiamat, the waters of chaos. Genesis has the spirit of God hovering over the waters of Tohu Wabohu. It's the exact same messy room, just a different description of who is doing the cleaning and how many entities are involved.
Safa Kaçmaz's research solidifies this continuity perfectly. Monotheistic texts continue the exact same ordering and arranging model found in the ancient myths. They are part of a shared, continuous human tradition of understanding creation as the establishment of order, boundaries, and structure.
So the shift wasn't about the how.
Exactly. The shift in monotheism wasn't changing how creation happened. The shift was attributing that ordering to a single omnipotent God rather than a pantheon of competing deities.
So by insisting on this false dichotomy, by teaching that ex nihilo is the defining characteristic of advanced religion, this academic framework is fundamentally confusing theological interpretation with historical data.
Spot on. They are taking a theological defense mechanism from the patristic period and treating it as if it were the raw, original data of the ancient world.
Which is wild.
It is a methodological failure because it prioritizes a later narrative over the explicit words of the text they're supposed to be studying.
Man, we have covered an incredible amount of territory today. I mean, traversing from ancient Babylonian epics to the Hellenistic debates of the early church fathers, all the way to critiques of modern anthropological theory.
It's a huge journey.
It is. And what we are looking at is a profound paradigm shift in how we understand our own intellectual history.
The foundational takeaway from the sources is incredibly clear. Ex nihilo creation from absolute nothingness is not humanity's oldest idea. It is not the original direct teaching of the major sacred texts.
Right.
And utilizing it as a metric to divide human history into primitive and advanced stages is both historically inaccurate and scientifically flawed. It is a dogma born of later philosophical necessity.
It just fundamentally changes how we interact with the past. I mean, we've been told for so long that the ultimate creator didn't just draw the house, they conjured the paper, the crayons, and the concept of drawing out of a pure void. But when we strip away the centuries of commentary and actually look closely at the page, well, we can see the messy scribbles. We see the chaotic waters. We see the boundaries being drawn and the structures being built. We see the architect organizing the chaos, not the wizard performing a magic trick.
It's a much more grounded reality.
It really is. Which leaves us with a critical lens to apply far beyond the realm of ancient texts. It really challenges you to look at the information you consume. Because if humanity's ultimate foundational story, the very origin of the universe, was heavily edited centuries later to fit a specific philosophical agenda.
What else has been?
Exactly. What other foundational truths in our history, our culture, or even our science are actually just centuries-old interpretations that we've blindly accepted as the raw original truth? Definitely something to think about.